We need to think big. We live in a world of increasing specialties where we take things, we take people, and we break them down into smaller and smaller bits. We need to think big. While there can be value in taking a look at these smaller and smaller bits, you lose something in the process. You lose perspective. You lose perspective of the big picture. You lose perspective of the fact that you're dealing with a person. It's the proverbial you lose the forest for the trees, where if you look at a tree, you look at that tree in isolation, you lose perspective that that tree exists in an ecosystem. It's in relationship with things. It has balance with things. And when you affect one thing, that affects something else. We need to think big. We live in a world of increasing marketing messages where we're bombarded with incredible amounts of information, and we're essentially brainwashed into believing certain things that may or may not be true. We're taught that you can take a certain pill to deal with an issue. We're taught that you can take a supplement to deal with a symptom. We've become symptom-based, and we need to think big. What I'm going to be speaking to you about today is all about this. The World Health Organization defines health as the complete state of physical, emotional, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of symptoms. And that absence of symptoms is the key component here. We're not meant to be focusing on symptoms. We need to deal with the root cause, and we've lost the big picture. We don't know these days, how do we gain health? How do we lose health? And we've lost the perspective, and again, we need to think big. That question up there, every single one of you is asked in one way, shape, form, or another. You've asked that question saying, why am I the way that I am? How did I get this particular chronic degenerative problem? Or maybe perhaps more relevantly, why does my child have a learning disability or have a particular problem? This is the question we need to be asking. We must come back to this question time and time again, which is, why am I unwell? And I'm going to explain this to you, and we're going to start off by looking at the orange arrow here. And that represents the stresses that exist in our life. That says the deconstructive stresses, and those stresses are represented not just by what you think. So you're probably thinking stress is mental and emotional stress. That's only one small part. You've also got to take into account chemical stress and physical stress. And if these stresses outweigh the innate ability of the body to heal, which is represented by this green stress, things will decline. And this innate ability of the body to heal, this green arrow part, is a fascinating bit. And I want to share a little bit of a story for you to understand how this works. This is the Human Body Encyclopedia. And at the time, a few years ago, my 8-year-old daughter at the time came to me with this very book, and it was the funniest thing. She goes, "Dad, you have to see this. You have to see what's in this book. It's so gross." And let me just tell you what it said. So on page 9, and remember, this is a little 9-year-old, super excited, coming to her dad, who she knows does this sort of work, and she goes, "Dad, right here it says, more than 2,000 dead skin cells fell off you while you read this sentence." And I thought, bloody cool. I thought, that is amazing. And I turned around and I asked her the question. I said, "So does that mean that your skin's getting thinner and eventually you're going to run out?" And she looked at me with horror and thinking, "Am I going to run out of skin?" And of course that's not what happens. What happens is that we have a way of regenerating, and we create new cells underneath the old cells that are going off. And this is a constant regeneration. This is an innate ability of the body to heal. If you get cut, do you have to consult a user manual? No. Your body knows exactly what to do and when to do it. Your red blood cells that you have today, they're completely different to the ones that you had 4 months ago, 120 days ago. That's why smokers that quit smoking have a huge burst of energy after 120 days, because they don't have those red blood cells that were contaminated with carbon monoxide. And here's the real clincher if you're having trouble grasping this innate ability to heal. The very bones that you have in your body right now, that you think of as being permanent, inalterable, and they're always there, they are not the same bones that you had 10 years ago. They're brand new. We have an innate ability of the body to heal. And when things go wrong, it's not because this goes wrong. It's because this goes wrong. And let me give you an example to understand how this works in practice. And let's take the example of a woman with a headache. And a woman with a headache, when she was born or in her younger years, would have been way up here. Everything would have been fine. And then gradually through life, you can imagine this picture, right? It's a pretty common picture where a woman's in a stressful job. Maybe she's got problems at home with the kids and problems in relationships. So that's an example of a mental, emotional stress. That'll cause a tension headache, won't it? Or contribute to it. And then there's also physical stresses we have to consider. And if someone sits at a desk, or if they slump all the time, or if their neck's out of alignment, that's a physical stress that'll contribute to a headache. That makes sense. And then chemically, if someone has too much copper in the system, and that may sound odd to some of you right now, but if someone has too much copper or mercury in the system, that'll contribute to a headache. So picture this woman now who's got all of these stresses over the years, and gradually she declines because these stresses outweigh these stresses. Everyone follow? So what happens is eventually she drops below this line and she develops a headache. Now what is that woman going to do? Honestly, give me an honest answer. Most people are going to reach for a Nurofen or a Panadol. And you want to know what? Give it credit, it works. It works on the symptom. I'd prefer a more natural alternative to the Panadol, but it works on the symptom. But here's the issue. She comes back up above this line to here, but because she didn't deal with this, everyone know what's going to happen next? She's going to get another headache. And so on begins what we like to call the revolving door. She just goes round and round. The problem keeps getting worse. The headaches get worse. She's having to take 2 Panadols, then codeine. Then she's got daily headaches that don't go away. And she's sitting here going, how do I get off this wheel? Where's the exit? What's going on through here? And she has no answers. This is the revolving door that we have to pay attention to. And if we want success, it lies in here. Now, there's another piece to this chart that I haven't fully explained to you yet. And let's change the example from a woman with a headache to a child with a learning difficulty. Okay? What if the possibility exists that instead of this child being born up here, that perhaps they were born down here? Would that child be more susceptible to falling below this line versus a child who was born up here? Can everyone see the point that I'm making? So what if the child that was born down here was given a vaccine on one particular day and the child up here was given a vaccine on the same day? Would you have 2 different responses? Absolutely, because we're born with different burdens. We're born at different points on this particular spectrum. And we have to understand this. We're going to come back to this time and time again. Now, there's more going on than just acknowledging that chronic stress is the basic cause of virtually all chronic degenerative problems. There's more going on than just this. It gets fascinating. See, we have to ask the question, stress may be present, but at some point in time, if a body is normal, and then that body shifts to, we can call it disease or whatever we want to call it through here, if there's a change, that means that we're able to measure it. So whether we use a blood test to measure a change or whether we use a hair analysis or whatever testing mechanism we want to use, if you can measure a change in chemistry, there has to be a reason for that. And this may not sound like much to you at the moment. Maybe you're just wrapping your head around this, but this is the key here. Because it turns out that there's only 5 reasons that a body will go from normal to abnormal. 5 reasons. And you can see up here I've got these listed: deficiencies, excesses, imbalances, and toxins. Now, before you all question my math and think I'm crazy and can't tell 5 from 4, I left out the 5th one because the 5th factor is actually genetics. It's been talked about a little bit already, but less than 5% of us can claim true genetic issues because of this epigenetic factor that exists. See, we're all born with genetic predispositions. We're all born with particular nasties that can develop. In fact, we're all born with genes for tails. We don't see these genes necessarily expressing because we have a way of subduing them to make sure that they don't come out. And if they are going to be activated, they have to be activated by the environment. So less than 5% of us can claim true genetic issues, things like cystic fibrosis. So we have to understand there's only these 4 factors. And if you can identify these and fix those, combined with dealing with the stresses, can you see the ability of the body to naturally heal, repair, and reverse most chronic degenerative problems? Does this start to make more sense? It's absolutely fascinating when we look at it this way. So let's take a look at a couple of things. We're going to go through these 4 factors, and deficiency is one of them that I find people can't or won't believe can actually create these problems we're seeing in our children. They think it's too simple. How can a possible deficiency, if it even exists in Australia, can you be deficient in Australia? How could that cause these problems that we're seeing? And I'll turn around to these people and I'll say, well, how long are you going to last without oxygen? Oxygen is a nutrient that we need. If you think about a cell, it needs nutrients. If it's not getting it, how can it function? Certainly, how can it function well? So a deficiency is a huge deal. And in Australia, we have deficiencies. We have zinc deficiencies. We have selenium deficiencies in the soil. And if it's not in the foods and it's not in the soils, it's pretty difficult to get it into us. So deficiencies are very common. Now, I need to explain what you're looking at up there because I know some people won't understand this. This is a hair tissue mineral analysis that you're looking at. It's very similar to a blood test in that you're measuring something. And what you're looking at here, I know it's hard to read, this says calcium and this says magnesium. And the levels here, they shouldn't be down here. This is a deficiency. They should be up here in this blue zone. Now, it might be worthwhile to point out, this is a 2-year-old child. Right there, 2-year-old boy. With hair analysis, though, in addition to the blood testing, you might be asking the question, well, why would I use a hair analysis? Why? That sounds a little bit too different. Why not just use a blood test? And there's some really good reasons for this. And if you stop and think about it, chronic degenerative problems, the things we're dealing with our kids or ourselves or whatever it is, ask yourself, is that problem happening in the blood or in the tissues and the organs? Is it in the blood? No. We're not struggling with an epidemic of blood diseases. We're struggling with an epidemic of tissue problems. So why would we rely solely on blood testing when the problem is in the tissues? And part of the problem is you can't go around taking bits of brain and liver and guts and things like that from all these little kids and people, but you can use representative tissues, and that's where a hair tissue sample is excellent. Another way of looking at this is if you broke your leg, would you want to get a blood test or an x-ray? And it doesn't mean that a blood test is a bad test. It just means that for that particular problem, it might not be the best test. Now, there's another reason that we want to use hair tissue analysis or tests that are tissue tests as a broad category, and that has to do with sensitivity. Now, you may or may not know that blood is maintained in a very tight homeostatic range. Your body does not want that to change, and it'll basically fix that at almost all costs. So if we take the level of calcium here, and if, let's say, the blood calcium started to drop to these low levels, what your body would do in its wisdom, remember, innate ability of the body to heal, is it would pull that calcium from the tissues, particularly the bones or other places where calcium are quite prevalent, and it would sacrifice the bones to maintain the blood. This is exceptionally common, and this is one of the things that we need to be aware of that these tissue tests start to pick up. So how many women, and it's mostly women in the audience, may have perhaps thought they had thyroid problems, and they screaming with thyroid symptoms. They go to the doctor, they do the blood test, and it comes back and no, your thyroid is fine, all the blood tests are fine. I can tell you, this is a far more sensitive way to pick up early changes before they're clinical. And that's why we use tissue testing. So let's get back to the deficiency side of things. 2-year-old boy struggling with burnout and general behavior, mental, emotional issues. Deficient in calcium, magnesium, and over here you can see zinc. I want to focus on zinc for a second because a lot of people would realize that zinc is important to brain function. Alertness, mood, cognitive function, there's a whole heap of things. But it's also important for digestion, it's also important for the immune system. It's a critically important mineral. We need it in huge amounts. Let's take a look at an example of how a deficiency might affect a child. Now, what we're looking at here is a biochemical pathway which I'm going to make simple. I'm not going to bore people with technical stuff. What we're looking for here is serotonin. And I want you to think of your body as being a factory that makes serotonin. And if you've got a factory that's making serotonin, you have to have raw materials that are delivered to that factory, don't you? You got to get the raw building materials. Then you have to have the factory that has the machinery inside it to be able to generate the serotonin. And then you need trucks or trains to be able to get it to the rest of the body. This is the analogy that we can use. What would happen if proteins are the building blocks? They're the raw materials. What would happen if a child was a picky eater and didn't eat enough proteins that had the amino acid tryptophan in it? Would that child be able to produce enough serotonin? No. What would happen if this child was deficient in zinc here, or zinc here? You see, to go from proteins to L-tryptophan to this requires all these nutrients. If the nutrient's not there, how can a body function and do what it's supposed to do? This child, unfortunately, is low in zinc, so he's got a double bottleneck. And remember, I also pointed out calcium being low. There's calcium, and there's magnesium. And this sort of understanding of deficiencies, simple deficiencies, can go a very long way to explaining what's happening with our children and with ourselves when it comes to these chronic problems. Now, the next factor that changes cells from normal to abnormal, this is the key, is actually excesses. And excesses is not something we generally think of. Some of us think more is better, and it couldn't be further from the truth. Everything has to be in balance. So if we look at excess, what you're looking at here is you can just see it here, it's a 14-year-old boy who's struggling with anxiety, tics, inability to sleep, behavioral issues. And this one here stands out like a sore thumb. I think everybody can see that. What you can't see is that that's copper. Okay? That's an excessively high level of copper in a 14-year-old boy. When you see an excess, this is where we have to put our holistic thinking hat on. That is not the end diagnosis. We have to then ask the question, why on earth would that be going high? What's the reason behind it? Remember, we got to go why, thinking really big picture. And there's a reason for that. And I need to explain it in a way that everyone's going to understand. So all the women in the audience here will know that on day 14 of a menstrual cycle, you've got a peak of estrogen. Everyone knows this. Did you know that you also have a peak of copper on day 14, that it is tied in to estrogen? So as estrogen goes up, copper goes up, and as estrogen comes down, copper comes down. What happens is this. There's a whole group of chemicals that a lot of us have been talking about called these xenoestrogens and all these plastics like BPA, all these things. These chemicals mimic estrogen. They're called xenoestrogens or strange estrogens. So if you get exposed to these things, and they're the plastics, the petroleum products, the pesticides, unfermented soy, arsenic, all of these things are estrogen mimickers. If you're exposed to these things, what's going to happen to your copper level, and birth control pills and other hormones in the food chain and things like that, what's going to happen to the copper level over time? It's going to go up and up and up. And then you're going to have the symptoms that go along with this. Now, there's another part of this slide that I think you'll find fascinating, and you can't see it, but this test is not a first test. This is a retest. And this boy came to me previously, and his level of copper, for those of us that are close enough here, was at 30. Okay? This chart stops at 7. So do a little bit of quick math. Double 7 to 14, double that to 28. Copper level is somewhere way up like that. That's insane. And we put him on a program that could deal with this copper and estrogens and chemicals. And it turns out when you understand the science behind minerals and the balancing things, that you can use minerals to offset the copper. So very quickly, everyone would be familiar with the fact that if you take vitamin D, that helps you to absorb calcium. Some nods, everyone understands vitamin D helps. That's called a synergistic relationship, well established. What you might not know is there's also, by default, antagonistic relationships. When one thing goes up, another thing goes down. And it turns out if you want copper to come down, you use things like zinc, vitamin C, magnesium, B6, and molybdenum. And we also had him using an infrared sauna to help get these detoxing chemicals out of him, the estrogen mimickers, and had fantastic success to go from somewhere way up here down to there. So those are excesses. Stay. Okay, imbalances is a concept that most people are not familiar with. But it makes sense, doesn't it? If something can be low and something can be high, you're going to have an imbalance. And an imbalance can be absolutely critical. And people looking at tests almost always look at the level of individual things instead of the relationships. Remember I said at the beginning, you lose the forest for the trees? Everything's in relationship. This is an example of what's called fast oxidation. This is a 1-year-old boy. Hyperactive, ADHD, inability to focus. And this is an example of fast oxidation. And what you're seeing is sodium and potassium being up high, calcium and magnesium being down low. That's the clinical picture of this fast oxidation. But you need to understand what fast oxidation is. From the food that you put into your mouth, you go through all the long, convoluted processes of creating energy, don't you? Makes sense. From food to ATP, and all the cycles in between to get to that point. And logically, we would look at this and say that can be normal speed, or it can be a faster speed than usual, or a slower speed than usual. This is a faster speed. And this child was creating energy far quicker than we could basically keep up with. And this kid was bouncing off the walls, and there's a reason for it. If we look at these low levels of calcium and magnesium and zinc over here, has anyone heard the old wives' tale that if you can't sleep, drink a glass of warm milk? Do you know why that works? It's the calcium. Calcium, there's some tryptophan in there, that's sedative in its elements. Calcium is sedative. So is magnesium, so is zinc. And then there's also stimulative minerals and vitamins. This child was low in all the sedatives. So when you put him on a program of the right nutrients and diet and overall approach that we're going to explain, we were able to fix this problem really quite simply. Imbalances are critical. And I'll give you another example. Remember I said previously how zinc would cancel out copper, right? Zinc and copper are opposites. If you were to look here, here's copper, okay? That's a fairly high, that's normal. Here's zinc, which is a little bit low. But imagine if this copper was just a little bit higher up here. You would have copper being dominant over zinc. And even if zinc, this is the point, even if zinc levels were normal, and everyone's testing zinc, and they're saying your zinc is normal, I really don't care. It doesn't matter if your zinc is normal if you've got these antagonists that are actually blocking it from working properly. And that is a really important thing to understand with imbalances. And no one talks about this. It blows my mind. All right, and toxins. Lots of people talk about toxins. This is the exact same boy. Okay? So everyone saw before, we had this fast oxidation picture here, calcium, magnesium low, and zinc there. What I've added on here is this boy's toxic metal profile. And that's what you see down here. Now let's go through this one by one, because I realize you can't see this exactly, but this here says lead. We took lead out of petrol for a reason, right? That causes cognitive learning disabilities in our children, and we took it out for that reason exactly. And here's a 1-year-old, that is showing clinical, objective, non-arguable evidence of lead in the system. It doesn't end there. This is mercury. You know, where's the mercury coming from? Over here we've got arsenic. And over here we've got aluminium, which is off the top of the measuring chart. Aluminium, as a lot of you know, is linked into Alzheimer's. And I mention that because it's a neurological issue. With a lot of these children that we're dealing with, they're neurological issues, and toxic metals are a big part of this. And he's also showing a high level of nickel. Now, I show you all of this because the question is, where the heck is this stuff coming from? And Sarah has addressed this briefly. This is placenta transfer. It's a scary concept. People don't like to talk about it. That's exactly what has happened in this child. And that's just the toxic metals that we're measuring. You can't measure very well all the chemicals, all the toxins. But we can say definitively there's enough evidence out there with the various blood testing and tissue testing. It's a big deal. And we can use this to monitor people's progress. So that's a 1-year-old boy. Now, there's a couple other things I want to talk about toxins. And they really work in two different ways, toxic metals. And they're fascinating ways that people don't generally understand. One is that they replace nutrients, and two is that they block nutrients. So let's talk about replacing nutrients first. Let's use a farming example, because a lot of people here are really good with food and understanding what's happening with the food that we put in. In a typical farmer's field, that farmer, if he was being somewhat responsible, might do a soil analysis. And he might look at his soil and say, I want to know what's going on in there because I want to produce some good products. I want it to grow big, have lots of stuff. So he does this and he finds out that he's got a few deficiencies, and he gets advised to put a certain fertilizer on there, which is often NPK fertilizer. Now, NPK fertilizer, if you look at it, actually has a byproduct of cadmium in it. Cadmium, this boy doesn't have cadmium, but that's listed right here. And this cadmium, when you put the fertilizer all over the field, is present in the environment. Now, one concept we need to understand of replacing things is this. You know how Sarah went back to the periodic table of the elements or to genetics in high school chemistry? We're going back to high school chemistry again. And I hated it at the time, but I love it now. Periodic table of the elements, you know, hydrogen, helium, carbon, neon, all those things. If you look at that closely, you'll see that there's what's called a zinc series. And you've got zinc, mercury, and cadmium, all stacked one on top of the other. So what it means for simplistic understanding is that they're like cousins. They're related in a certain way, if you want to think of it that way. So we go back to my example. You've got the farmer's field. You've got a field that's deficient in zinc, okay? And he's trying to grow some hay, grass. And he puts down the crop, and the crop starts looking around saying, where's my zinc? You know, I need my zinc. And put this in context of a child who needs zinc as well. It's no different. And this looks around, and it looks around and says, there's no zinc here. What am I going to do? And it reaches around and it looks and says, cadmium, you look a little bit like zinc. Let's plug you in, and you'll function and keep me going. But that plant is now only going to be functioning maybe, I don't know, 10, 20, 30% of its maximum efficiency, but it survives. So now let's say you got the cadmium in the plant. What if the cow eats the grass? Well, that one's a no-brainer. That cadmium is now in the cow. So what if that cow doesn't want the cadmium and it wants to eliminate it? Anything that leaves the body's fair game, including milk. So let's say the milk now has the cadmium in it, and we used chocolate analogies a couple of times here. Let's say the cadmium gets into the chocolate that's made from the milk, and you eat the chocolate. These things are sneaky, and they get into you, and they replace nutrients. And that example I gave you of chocolate was a real case study in the US, not that long ago. So that's one way that they work, is replacing nutrients. And once it's replaced, you're in trouble. You have to work really hard to have those cells regenerate and replace the bad nutrients. And the second way that toxic metals work is even more interesting. And this chart looks fancy, but it's basically showing the theoretical blockages of these toxic metals. So you've got cadmium and mercury and so on. So let's use mercury because everyone seems to understand mercury. Mercury blocks iron, it blocks zinc, and it blocks selenium. That's really important to understand. And we go all the way back into the early 1990s. And the Nobel Prize, this is a big prize, it was won for this discovery of these things called channelopathies. And these channelopathies are basically saying that if mercury is present on a cell, then that cell is basically shut down, and things can't get in, and things can't get out. So imagine now we go back to my thyroid example, or a child needing zinc. And let's say the body says, we need some zinc, we need some thyroid hormone. The body cooperates, it makes it, it circulates around the bloodstream, it comes right up to the cell, knocks on the cell's door very politely and says, I'm the zinc you ordered, let me in. Mercury comes out of the shadows, crosses his arm in front of the door like this, and says, we don't like your type around here, you're not welcome, you're not coming in. Again, normal blood tests, abnormal tissue tests, and the reason is these channelopathies that were discovered in the 90s. Go to your GPs and say, can you tell me about channelopathies? It's not understood. Now, channelopathies have been studied to a certain extent, and I'll give you an example. Mercury is attributed or correlated with a lot of these issues that we see in our kids. And they did a study, a hair analysis study, and they had the hypothesis that if we were to look at the severely autistic kids, and then the moderate, and then the mild, they had the hypothesis, logically, that the severe kids should have the most mercury. Make sense? Right? The more severe, they thought there'd be more mercury, and they thought there'd be less mercury in the less autistic kids. They did the hair analysis study, and they didn't find that. They found the exact opposite. They didn't find the mercury in the severely autistic kids. And can you tell me why? It couldn't get out. The mercury was so locked up in these kids' brains and tissues with these channelopathies being shut down that the mercury wouldn't let the bad out and it wouldn't let the good in. And that is a critical thing to understand, and we've got to be addressing these issues with respect to that. We really need to think big. So what I hope I've been able to do so far is address this issue of understanding big thinking, understanding stress, understanding that stress is huge in driving this factor, and that we're born at certain levels based on that stress because the innate ability of the body to heal is there. So what we need to do now is ask this question, is what can we do from a holistic, complete perspective of how do we address this particular problem? And this is the model that we use. And the first step that we use with people is we do the hair tissue mineral analysis. And the way that that works, because some people might be interested in knowing a little bit more about this, is a person would go onto our website, they would order the test kit, which is usually $160. It's actually $140 this weekend. And we would post it to them. They would take the sample at home. They would then post that off to the lab. And then the lab sends us the results, and we contact them by phone. Now, I mention that specifically because notice it's all at a distance. I actually work with over 95% of the people that I work with that are not in Cairns. They're all either all over Australia or in a lot of other countries. So we can work with anyone, anywhere. And this is how we start, is by going right in the middle here with that hair analysis to look for, and I hope you can tell me now, deficiencies, excesses, imbalances, and toxins. And then we sit down with the person and we find out what their stresses are, physical, chemical, emotional, and we work with them to try to get rid of those stresses. Try to dump out whatever they can. Clean up your closet. Speak to the people through here about cleaning up all the sort of toxins in the house and things like that. And then when we get to the point where there's nothing else we can eliminate at the moment, and we still have those deficiencies, excesses, and toxins to deal with, we put into place this, what I call, containment system. And it consists of things like diet. I'm not going to get into diet here. There's other people that can do a better job at that than me. But diet is critical, isn't it? Everyone will agree that diet is critical. I don't know if everyone would agree that if you've got a person who has such a high toxic burden that diet alone won't fix the issue. But you can't fix it without good diet. So we have to have an excellent diet, and we often have to do a little bit more. We have to address the lifestyle factors. People need to slow down. We have to look at the emotional, mental factors. Healing is an interesting thing, and I give an entire other workshop on understanding stress and how it works. If a crocodile is jumping out at you, that's a big stress, especially up here, especially coming from Canada. And if a crocodile is jumping out at you and you're under stress, your body is in what's called a sympathetic fight-or-flight state. There is no healing, there is no elimination, there is no digestion. None of these things are happening properly. You need to be in the healthy parasympathetic state, and we need to keep these kids and people in as relaxing an environment as possible, and a lot of the other speakers have talked about ways to do that. So diet, emotional, mental, lifestyle, and then over here is detoxification. It needs to be addressed, but there's no magic bullet. There is no one magic bullet to do detoxification. You have to reduce exposure. You have to inhibit the sympathetic nervous system. You have to use foods to get natural chelators into the diet. You have to use natural chelators, but you also use natural antagonists, the whole zinc and copper, selenium and mercury. You have to use the natural antagonists, and other procedures can be used as well. Infrared saunas are exceptionally well documented to speed up the process of elimination. Anything that leaves the body's fair game, including sweat. And it works on the liver and penetrates, and sometimes coffee enemas can go a long ways and can be a lifesaver for some people. So detoxification has to be addressed. And last but not least is the correct supplements. If people are guessing with supplements, it drives me crazy. Because if we acknowledge, and I hope everyone takes this on board, if we acknowledge that supplements can and do work, and they do, then we have to acknowledge that the wrong ones hurt. And if we're guessing, I'm not in favor of that. And that's why I like to use the tissue analysis test and retesting. Because again, you may be on the right supplements now, but what if you start eliminating mercury or copper and that starts to change your needs? You have to be retesting every so often to make sure you're on the right track. And with that, I think we're complete. So thank you very much, and really everyone, think big. Thank you.